Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing a quick review of Elantris. If you are at all following upcoming releases, or you're watching anything on BookTube, or you are a reader who isn't living under a rock, you're probably aware that the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive, called Rhythm of War, is going to be coming out this November. So in honor of that, I've decided that not only am I going to reread the other three books in the Stormlight Archive, but I'm going to reread everything that Brandon Sanderson has written in the entire Cosmere. So the first book that I decided to read in that sequence is Elantris, because it is chronologically both the first book that Sanderson published and also, as far as we can tell, the first book in Cosmere chronology that has been published so far. I used to be a huge rereader, and even back in college, I would always look through my Kindle and tell myself that I had to see if there was anything I felt like rereading before I decided to go buy a new book. Since then, I have become a little bit less of a rereader. I do still like to reread things, but I've also started taking out a lot of ebooks from the library, which helps supplement my book buying budget. And in addition, I think the older I get, time starts feeling a little bit shorter, so I'm a little more driven to read new things. But even so, I read Elantris several times back in the day, although it has been a few years since I reread it. So while I've read Elantris several times, and I've reread it enough times that I pretty much remember all of the details, it has still been a few years, and it's been long enough that my reactions are a little bit different than they used to be. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I wanted to commit to reviewing everything in the Cosmere as part of this reread, and I'm still not sure that I'm going to do a review for every single book that I read by Brandon Sanderson this year, but I still felt like talking about Elantris, so I'm going to at least do a review of this. The first Brandon Sanderson book that I ever read was Mistborn: The Final Empire, and that's usually a place that people are encouraged to start as a good entry point to the Cosmere. I'm going to try to start out spoiler-free, and then maybe towards the end of the video I'll throw in a few things that are spoilers with a warning. I'm assuming that a lot of the people that are interested in Brandon Sanderson may have read this book by now because it has been out for so long, but I'd still like to be good about not spoiling it for anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of reading it yet. I will say that Elantris was never my favorite Brandon Sanderson book, and in some ways I came to appreciate it a lot more on this reread, but some of the things that make it a little less polished than his later work are still true. This was actually the sixth book that he ever wrote, and I think I actually saw in a talk recently that he actually wrote 13 books before he had a book published, and the one that got bought first was actually Elantris, which was book number 6. At the time, the stuff that was selling the most in the fantasy genre was really dark stuff like George R.R. Martin, and also people thought that Sanderson's books were too long and editors weren't that enthusiastic about them. So because this was one of his earlier books that he wrote, the pacing and the character work don't really live up to his most recent books, where both of those things are really excellent. I don't find them to be things that make the book unreadable or even really a problem, but just having read as much of his stuff as I have, I am aware of those differences. I think he said that both writing the Mistborn trilogy and also finishing Wheel of Time really helped him refine his ability to develop character and to pace out longer works. Sanderson has always had a reputation for being the magic system guy, and that is still very true in his first book, Elantris, but the magic system itself isn't quite as delightful as what you find in some of his later books. The setup for this book, if you haven't read it, is that Elantris is a city where there used to be these powerful people who were started out as normal people and then became chosen magically and basically turned into gods, or people that were almost as powerful as gods, and they were the power basis for their entire country. And then suddenly 10 years ago, for some reason, their power broke and they became cursed, and everything kind of went downhill from there. There are 3 main Viewpoint characters in this book, and we split time between all 3 of them. Rothen is the prince who at the very beginning of the book is transformed into an Elantrian, which in this case, since the power of the city has fallen, he basically becomes a zombie. Like, his skin goes all dark and disgusting, and he no longer has a heartbeat, and he's not really alive, and he gets thrown into this cursed city of Elantris with all the other people like him, and he has to try to figure out a way to survive and maybe thrive and make the best out of his situation. We also have Serene, who is a princess from another country who was on her way to marry Rothen when all of this happened, and all she knows is that she has arrived, and apparently her fiance has died in the 3 days that she was on the ship, and she's now stuck in this unfamiliar situation with a lot of politics going on. But she is a very strong-willed character, and instead of being upset by all of this, she basically embraces it as a game and a challenge. The third character is kind of the antagonist. His name is Rothen, and he is a priest, basically a high priest from this other empire, and he has been sent to convert the people within 3 months, or else the country will be conquered with military force. So he is in an antagonist role to Rothen and Serene in terms of that he wants the opposite of what they want. He wants to convert the entire country, but he also has some motivations where he is kind of trying to save lives by converting people and trying to find a peaceful or, manipulative but not violent way to do it. I talked a little bit about my take on the characters in my May mid-month wrap-up already. I feel like Rothen is actually probably the most boring character that Sanderson has ever written, but I never really noticed it before because he's in some very interesting situations, he's doing some very interesting things, but other than being a pretty good, decently smart, optimistic guy that people seem to like, and he's a good natural leader, he doesn't have a lot of either character development or really a lot of character traits. It's not like I didn't like him, but when I think about the characters in Mistborn or the Stormlight Archive, there are not any characters as two-dimensional as him. Serene is actually the character that I find to be the most problematic because I think she is one of the worst female characters that Sanderson has ever written. I think his ability to write good female characters has really continuously improved, but in this book, even though I actually like her a lot as a character, she really falls into this trope of being sort of not like other girls. She is tall and opinionated and intelligent, and apparently all of the other women in the 2 kingdoms that she's lived in just are not as intelligent and forceful as her, and so she is really the only important female character in this entire book, and none of the other women in it have any meaningful role. I don't think it's a terrible characterization in terms of I understand that even in today's society, sometimes a strong, confident woman can end up worried that the force of her personality can drive away people from her, and society even today can judge that. But on the other hand, it was just too unbelievable that she was the only woman in this book that wasn't just a sheep. I do think it's clear when you get some of the other characters' perspectives that she's not as undesirable as she thinks she is, and I think that it is understandable why she would feel the way she does about having concerns about not being able to pursue a relationship, but it's still that lack of confidence in her ability to find a guy is just an element of her personality that I didn't really like. Other than that, in terms of how she functions as a character, she's actually quite enjoyable to read. But I think if you look at Sanderson's more recent work, like the Stormlight Archive, there are plenty of female characters and a lot of them are doing stuff, and it doesn't really fall into this more old school fantasy scenario where there is only one woman doing anything and there's only one woman who has a personality or any strength of character in an entire book. I mentioned in my mid-month wrap-up that Rothen the Priest is a character that I really came to appreciate in this reading of the book. I really enjoyed reading from his point of view because he's a very conflicted character, and even though he is basically working against the other 2 characters for a large part of the book, and you're not necessarily rooting for him, it's still really interesting to see things from his perspective, and you do kind of end up having sympathy for what he's trying to do. Compared to the others, there's actually a lot of development in his arc, and that's something you actually very rarely get in antagonist figures. Sanderson has always done a really interesting job writing different characters' perspectives on religion, and that's a really big part of Elantris. You have characters that are members of a bunch of different religions, and Rothen is trying to convert people to his religion. The religions many of them are related to each other, and characters have discussions about the similarities and differences. I think this is a theme that he has continued to explore in his other books. You have Sazed in Mistborn, who goes through a big arc that has to do with religion, and also Yasna in the Stormlight Archive, who is an atheist. So I think that's something that he continued to develop in later books, but I actually see a lot of the root of that exploration of religion here in his first book. One of the most satisfying things about this book is watching the characters work both together and against each other. Sometimes they're working together on purpose, sometimes they're working against each other on purpose, and sometimes they accidentally work against each other because they don't realize what they're doing. Things in the plot that seem like they should be straightforward, a lot of the time end up taking a different route. Elantris, like his other books, is very optimistic about human nature, and that's something I generally like about his writing. Unlike all of the books that are popular where all the characters are morally gray, which means that they're all kind of terrible, I feel like in Sanderson's writing, all the characters do have both good and bad in them, but that means that nobody is really that terrible. When bad things are happening, there's often some outside force or circumstance. You can always understand why the people that are doing bad things are where they are and why they're bad. Pacing is an issue for this book. It slows down in the middle, but it's mostly pretty good. But when you get to the last 100 pages, it's just completely chaotic and nonstop, which is hard in a book that's this long. Sanderson has referred to this before as the Brandon avalanche, and I think this is also a kind of pacing issue that he had in some of his earlier books that has mostly been resolved in his most recent books. Obviously, something as big as the Stormlight Archive books have to be more carefully planned out and paced than even a 600-page book like Elantris. Like I mentioned, I think there are a lot of themes in Elantris, like religion and class, that get explored maybe better in his later books, but I do think it's a solid entry in the Cosmere. I don't necessarily think it's the best place to start reading the Cosmere if you haven't read anything by him before. For that, I'd probably recommend Mistborn. Before I finish, I do want to mention a few spoilery things, both for the Cosmere and for Elantris in particular. So if you haven't read Elantris, maybe stop watching here. One of the things that I think he does brilliantly from this first book is his use of the magic as a plot device. He has described what he calls Sanderson's first law, which basically says that when you're writing, the better you explain the magic, the more you can use the magic in the plot. That is something that's used really well here in the way that he gradually develops your understanding of the Aeon Door, which is the magic system that is done by them writing characters in the air. And you have a long process of Rothen coming to understand how the magic works and why. And when he solves the issue that's going on with the magic, because of the way that there's been an earthquake and the land has split, you've already seen him come to the conclusion that the magic characters are based on the land, so you understand exactly what's going on when he's able to solve that problem through magic. Unlike in other books where when magic gets used as a plot device but you don't know why it works, it makes it a lot less satisfying. As a magic system, Aeon Door is not as fun as the magic systems in Mistborn or the ones in the Stormlight Archive, but as a part of the plot, it works really, really well. A lot of the things that happen in this book are pretty heavily foreshadowed, which was a big surprise the first time I read it, but then on subsequent rereads, it's not that subtle. You can kind of see all those things getting mentioned over and over again, kind of in neon lights, stuff like Rothen's arm being partly transformed, or Adian being a Elantrian the whole time, things like that. But I feel like there are other books where no matter how many times you reread, seeing those twists get foreshadowed is actually satisfying instead of being like, oh, okay, yeah, I remember that. In terms of the Cosmere, we get our first ever Hoid sighting here. It's kind of hard to think back about reading this book at a time where nobody knew what the Cosmere was, we didn't know who Hoid was, and we had no idea that this was going to be connected to his other books or that there was a larger plot going on behind the scenes in this book and all of the other ones. Now, reading this, it makes me really wonder things like, how did Galadon become a world hopper to the point where we see him showing up in the Way of Kings? There's absolutely no indication in Elantris of how that could come to pass. It's just something that obviously happens at some point in the future. While looking up a few things for this review, I did see that the newer editions of this book are a 10th anniversary edition. Obviously, this is a pretty old one, and so apparently in that new 10th anniversary version, he included an endnote with Hoid and some additional Cosmere stuff that I still haven't read. So I don't know, I don't really want to go out and buy a new copy just for that, but I think it's cool that a little bit more of that got inserted, and I'm looking forward to seeing it at some point. Sanderson has talked about Elantris having a sequel. Obviously, that hasn't been written yet, and I don't know if it ever will be. The book stands pretty well on its own, but it'll be interesting to see if that does get written someday. Also, Emperor's Soul, which is a novella, is set in the same world as Elantris. It basically doesn't doesn't have any connection, but I think it's one of the best things that he's ever written. Thanks so much for watching. It's always a little bit different doing a review of a book that I've read so many times compared to something I'm experiencing for the first time, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm looking forward to continuing this Cosmere reread this summer. Like I said, I don't know if I'll do a review of every single book in the Cosmere, but I will continue to share my thoughts on it as I make my way through the whole sequence.